Today's daf is daf lamed hey, and we're continuing a discussion that we began on daf lamed dalid with regard to kvia lemaiser. That means if peros were before gemar malacha, like the case of figs that have to be dried in the sun, and if the figs are not yet dried, that's before gemar malacha, and you're allowed to eat from those figs because there's no chiyuv trumas amaisus. Now, the Chachamim prohibited eating an achilas aroi in a case where there was kvius. That means where it was established for achila. However, the question is, where did Shabbos fit into this picture? And yesterday we began our discussion, which will continue today in Mitzvah Hashem, about whether Shabbos establishes the peros as if they had already gmar malacha. And the reason for that is because Shabbos gives a chashivus, a certain significance to the achila. The achila of Shabbos is a mitzvah of oneg Shabbos. But the question is, perhaps the kvius of Shabbos could only be meaningful after gmar malacha. And Masechet wanted to prove from our Mishnah, the Mishnah here on Daf Lamed Daled, that Shabbos is kovas even afilu kodem gemar malacha. So the Gemara says the following: how is it possible to assume that the reason why the kvius for maser, not in the case of Shvius, because again, as we discussed yesterday, in the case of Shvius, there is no Chiyuv Mas. But the Mishnah is implying that had it been any of the other 6 years of the Shemitah, then you have a Chiyuv of Maser because you have a status of Tevel. And the question is, if it's before Gemar Malach, in the case of these figs that haven't yet dried, why would there be any Isra Achila, even if I assume that there is a Kovea? And the Gemara suggested that we could reject the proof from our Mishnah the way Masechet had it, that Shabbos is the Kovea. Maybe there's a different Kovea. And that Kovea is Dibur, meaning when he says and declares that these are the figs that I'm going to eat from tomorrow, that gives those figs a certain chashivus, a certain significance, and it's irrelevant to Shabbos. Even during the week, the same halacha would apply. Once you make that declaration that this is where you're going to eat from, that statement, that dibur of achila, is kovei mas. So the Gemara says that's impossible. Valo mosaro chozer. The halacha is that when you have a group of fruits and you make a statement that you're going to eat from these fruits, the question is, how powerful, how much of an impact does that statement have? And here, Rabbi Eliezer, as we'll soon see, makes the following distinction. If he's eating all the fruits, the entire group, that gives it chashivus, and then, arguably, the dibur is kovei mas. It establishes as achila, and any achila will be an achila of tevel, you have to be mafresh mas. But if he only intends to eat part of the group, he's not going to eat all the fruits. That's called mosaro chozer. Mosaro chozer means I'm going to eat part of these group, the group of fruits. And mosar means that which I don't eat, I'll return it. So, for example, you have these figs that are baking in the sun, they're drying in the sun. He takes part of it and he says, I'm going to eat from part of it. And although, again, his statement was he's going to eat the fruits, but we know that there's going to be mosar. You won't be able to eat all the fruits. And keep in mind, the fruits haven't dried yet, so it's not really a perfect edible fruit, but he has decided, I'm going to eat from these fruits. However, if mosaro chozer, which means that he's going to have a surplus, a leftover amount of fruits, and he's going to put them back in the sun, exactly where they are, before the kvius of achila, then in such a case, the halacha is, according to Rabbi Eliezer, there's no kviyas lamasa. Kviyas lamasa has to be, as we said, a profound designation for achila, which includes everything in such a way that he won't return any surplus. V'shamina leila Rabbi Eliezer Diomar, Rabbi Eliezer maintains the position called heichad of motzro kozer lo kava. If the surplus is going to be returned back to the son, then there's no kviyas. It's an all or nothing proposition. It's got to be a very profound designation for achila. And if part of it is going to be choser, because he's going to have a vestige of what's left over and he's going to put it back in the son, then it's not a kviyas. And I'll prove it to you. It's not, we learned in the Mishnah in the fourth parak of Masros. Hanotel zeisim in amaton. Maton is a very large utensil, and you fill it up with zeisim, pack it in such a way that the olives get heated up, and that makes the oil within the olives already loosens it, so that now when you take it to the gat, meaning to the press, it's very relatively easy to remove the oil from the olive. So he has now zeisim that he's taking out of this large vessel. Tovel achas b'melach v'ochel. He's allowed to eat an achilas aroi. And why is he allowed to eat an achilas aroi? Because the gemar malach of these zeisim is to remove the oil. He hasn't yet removed the oil yet. He didn't even take it to the oil press. And therefore, he's only allowed to eat before Gemar Malacha what's called an achilas aroi. So he takes one zayis and he dips it in salt, eats it, then he takes another zayis. That's called achas b'melach. That's called an achilas aroi, which is permissible because we're before the Gemar Malacha. If, however, he puts all the olives from this matan on the table, take out the word asara, shouldn't be in the girsa, and now he dips them all as a group, not one by one, into salt, that's considered a kviyus l'maseh. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, it depends. It's not always the case, absolutely, that the fact that he dips it into salt is a kviyus l'maseh. It's going to depend upon this halacha of motsaro choser. Let's explain. He says, min matan tahar, if the zeisim are tahorim chayav, then we assume that for sure he wants to eat all of them, and there won't be any mosa, there won't be any surplus, because they're all tahorim. Hence, there's a kviyus l'maser, and in that circumstance, Rabbi Eliezer agrees to the Tanakama that he's chayiv in maser. There's a kviyus l'maser. But min amaton tameh, if the olives inside this large vessel are tmeim potur, then there's no din of kviyus, because we assume that he's not going to eat all the zeisim. He's going to have some leftover zeisim, which he returns back into the matan. So the Gemara explains, Havina, but we asked, Maishna Reisha, Maishna Seifa, what's the difference in the case where he takes the zeisim from a matan that's tar in the Reisha? And there we said he's chayav in hafrashas mas. There's a kviyus. Masha enken in the sefer, in the case where the matan is tamei, the zeisim atmeim, there we say there's no kviyus. Or Rabbi Avo comes to shed a light on Rabbi Eliezer. He says the following: in both the Reish and the Sefer, the person himself, the Gavra, is tamei. Reisha, however, the difference between the Reish and the Sefer is the status of the Zeisim. The Reisha is b'matan tar. The Zeisim themselves are tahorim, the Gavra tamei. Delo motzi mahadol. He will not be machzir Zeisim he will not return those zaysim that he doesn't eat back into the matan, because once a gavra tame took the zaysim out of the matan, then b'negiyaso, he now conveyed tuma to all the zaysim. And since the matan has zaysim tahorim, the last thing on his agenda is to take zaysim tmeim and mix them together with zaysim tahorim. That's not an option. Therefore, there won't be any surplus that's going to be replaced and returned into the matan. But seifa b'matan tamei, the gavra tamei, the matzi mehedele. What means is that if he has leftover olives, which he doesn't eat, he will return them into the matan, because all the olives that are contained in the matan are already tamei. He's tamei. The zaysim that he's going to return to the matan are tmeim, and all the rest, the entire balance of the zaysim in the matan are all tmeim. So this is a case of mosar choser, where the leftovers go back into their original state before the kviyas, and that undermines the kviyas. And therefore, in such a case, Rabbi Eliezer argues against Tanna Kama, there's no chiyuv masa. Now let's make a summary of where we're holding at this point. We take a pause. And we've now established that according to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, even if he takes a large number of fruits for the purpose of achila, but it's before Gemar Malacha, if he has the option of returning the leftover surplus fruits, that's not considered a kviyus, because there are those fruits that he will not eat and return them to the original state before the kviyus. And now we have the following difficulty that we have to address. How can we assume that Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah would hold that dibur, when he declares, I will eat from these fruits, that alone, even without Gemar Malacha, would be kovea? After all, if he has leftover fruits, he's choser. He puts them back under the sun in order to continue the process of baking them and drying them in the sun. How then can we possibly understand that according to Rabbi Eliezer, when he takes so many peros, before Gemar Malacha, the sun has not yet dried them, that there's a kviyas l'maseh, meaning on those years that are in Shemitah? How could that be? It's impossible to assume that dibur, the fact that he declares he will eat these peros, is kovea according to Rabbi Eliezer, because it's moser choser. All the mosoro will go back under the sun. And the Gemara answers, Masnisa nami b'muktzeh tahor v'gavra tamei. The case that our Mishnah is addressing is a case where he's tamei. However, the figs themselves, the muktzeh, that are drying in the sun, are tahorim, and therefore he doesn't have the option of returning the mosar, meaning the surplus figs, together with the other figs in the same basket under the sun, because then he's going to be metame that which is tar. So if there's no mosar choser, then enochinami, his statement, his declaration, I will eat from these peros, gives those peros the status of an achila chashuva, and that's a kviyus lamas. The Gemara asks, "V'alo muchzarim v'yomdim." I don't understand, says the Gemara. In our Mishnah, he's standing on the muktzeh, which again is tar, he's tamei. And the question is, can you tell me, according to Rabbi Eliezer, that now through his dibur, by declaring that he will eat from these fruits, he's miyached them, he designates them for achila, and that's going to be kovea? Impossible. He didn't do anything lamaisa. Talk is cheap. Did he take them into his hands? He's omeid ala muktzeh, v'omer, and he declares with a dibur. But he hasn't done anything besides a dibur. If he did an atila and he picked them up and designated them for achila, then fashtetach, I could understand nichali, that's considered a kviyas lamase. But in a case where all he was miyached b'dibur without any maisa, I mean, keep in mind, Rabbi Eliezer raises the bar on what's considered a kviyas lamase. Even in a case where he designates it for achila, but he might end up with some surplus and he's going to return the surplus, that itself is enough to undermine and vitiate the kviyas lamase. How much more so would Rabbi Eliezer agree that dibur without a netila, if he didn't take it into his hands, that could not possibly be a kviyas lamase. So at this moment in the sugya, the Gemara is now rejecting the possibility that the kviyas lamase that generates a chiyuv hafrosha, according to Rabbi Eliezer and our Mishnah, is based on dibur alone. It cannot be based on dibur. And therefore, we go back to our original premise, which Mar Zutra, if you remember, had tried to prove his father's premise of Nachman, that Shabbos is kovas lemaser even before Gemar Malacha. If that be the case, says Rav Shimi, I have another way of rejecting any possibility of deriving a conclusion halacha l'maisa from our Mishnah that Shabbos kovas lemaser afilu kodem Gemar Malacha. And why is that? Because Rabbi Eliezer is a unique approach. He is the dissenting view, the minority view, against the Chachamim, against the Rov. And he's being very consistent. Where do we see a precedent for this concept that Shabbos is kovas before Gemar Malacha? Rabbi Eliezer, Ka'amrit, you want to prove something la from Rabbi Eliezer? Rabbi Eliezer l'taimei. Rabbi Eliezer is just simply reflecting an extension, as a consistency in his own view. The Omar, he says, Truma Kava, that if he has payros, even before Gemar Malacha, and he's mafresh Truma from those payros, the Afrosha's Truma itself is enough to give a chashimus to the payros, such that that's called kviyus. And that is kovela maser, even though it's before Gemar Malacha. And he's not allowed to eat any of these payros after Afrosha's Truma, even Achilas Aroi, because he was Koveya them for Maser, the Truma Kovas LaMaser, even before Gemar Malach. So this is Rabbi Eliezer, who recognizes the possibility of being Koveya LaMaser before Gemar Malacha. If he did so with regard to Truma, he's going to do so with regard to Shabbos. And maybe Shabbos is even greater of a kovas than Truma. And Kolshkein Shabbos, why is Shabbos even greater? Because as we said before, there's a mitzvah vonik Shabbos. So Achil on Shabbos has a special status, it has a chashivus, and certainly Shabbos is kovas lamaser, even with regard to Peros, kodem shenigmar malachta. But the Chachamim, they rejected Rabbi Eliezer. They held Truma is not kovas lamaser, and then we can certainly argue that just like Truma is not kovas lamaser, Shabbos likewise is not kovas lamaser. And we have a principle in halacha that Rabbim v'yachid halacha k'Rabbim, and therefore if the Chachamim rejected Rabbi Eliezer with regard to Truma, likewise they will reject Rabbi Eliezer with regard to Shabbos. We're going to accept the sheet of the Chachamim, and we're going to raise the bar on what constitutes a kviyus lamaser to prohibit achilas aroi kodem gvar malacha, and the answer will be that Truma is not a kovas. We're going to pass like the Chacham that Shabbos is not a kovas. Now, where do we find the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Chacham with regard to Truma, where the Truma kovas lamaser? This nan in the Mishnah, the second parak of Masros, Peros shetraman. Adjalo nigmar malachton, you are mafresh Truma before Gmar Malacha, and apparently, even though there's no chiv Truma maser before Gmar Malacha, but nevertheless his hafrosh is meaningful if he initiates on his own a hafrosha, and now he's kovela maser, he cannot eat from these peros an achila, even an achilas haroy, until such time that he's mafresh maser. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Lechol Man Aroy. Rabbi Eliezer says Oser. It's osir to eat achilas haroy because truma kovas lemaser. Chachamim atirim. They hold that ain't truma kovas lemaser kodem gemar malach. Now the Gemara wants to bring a proof from our Mishnah to Rav Nachman that Shabbos is kovas lemaser even before gemar malacha, from the sheet of the Chachamim who rejected Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah. Tashma miseifa. Chachamim omrim ad sheyirshom v'yomar mikan v'ad kan. What the Chachamim require in order to remove the Isur Muktzah from this Muktzeh is Rishima. Rishima means he's got to not only state that he's going to eat from these payros and specify, designate those, he's got to add a Rishima, he's got to add a Simon, L'Dovar. So it's not enough to just to say, Mikan ani ochel l'mochar, he needs also Rishima. Okay. Now, let's go back to the Mishnah. The reason why you're going to have a problem of Muktzeh is on Erev Shabbos Shvius the Labar Asurihi. You have no problem of Muktzeh, of Muktzah with regard to these payros on a Shemitah year because there's no Maseh. It means that according to Chachamim, if it was any of the other 6 years, the balance of the Shemitah cycle, then even if he made a Rishima that he's going to eat from these payros, nevertheless, he's chayav in Maser, and he's not allowed to be Ma'aser on Shabbos. My timer, wait a minute, it's before Gmar Malach. We're talking about tziyah, we're talking about figs that are being dried in the sun. They're not yet ready to eat. Why would in Shar Shonim be an Isa because of Tevel and a Chiv Maser? The answer is Lav, shouldn't we assume? Mishum, the Shabbos cover. So we see that even Chachamim hold the Shabbos is kovas, even with regard to Peres Kodem, Shenigma Malachton. And if that be the case, then you can't push off the raya and say, well, you'll bring a raya from Rabbi Eliezer. We don't paskin like Rabbi Eliezer, who holds that Truva kovas. We paskin like Chachamim that Truva ain't a kovas. No. Here you see in our Mishnah, we're not talking about Truva, we're talking about Shabbos, and Shabbos is kovas on Shar Yimos, Shar Shnos HaShemitah, even on Peros, Shalom Nigmar Malachta. And the Gemara rejects it. Lo. Now, the next piece of Gemara we've seen already when we went through the Chakavatai Rabbi Eliezer. Gemara is going to go through the identical Chakavatai according to the Chacham. Shiny Hasam, the Omar Mikan Ad Kan Ani Ochel L'mocha. Here, the Kovea is not Shabbos. It's the Dibur. It's his verbal declaration that he will eat from these payros. That's Kovea. And it's the Dibur that's Kovea. And achila, no matter what achila it is, even though it looks like and tastes like aroy, but it's an achilas keva because he was kovea through his dibur. So therefore, the payros are asur, and they're mukta even for achilas aroy, but not because of Shabbos. Has nothing to do with Shabbos, but just has to do with his dibur mikan ani ochel. Nui hachi my Shabbos. The same old question that we asked earlier on Rabbi Eliezer, we're going to ask now on the Chachamim. Why does this mission appear here in Masechet Beitza with regard to Moed, with regard to Shabbos and Seder Moedim? This really belongs to Zroim. This mission should be placed in Masechet Maisros because this halacha that Dibur is Kovei Maser to prohibit an achilas aroy before Gmar Malacha belongs in Hilchas Masros. It applies the whole week long. It's not a Shabbos halacha. It's not a Moed halacha. The Gemara answers the reason why it appears here in our Mishnah in Beitza is to tell me an additional chiddush that tevel muchanu eitel Shabbat shema avar v'tikno mitukan. That the Mishnah wants to be mechadish to you that as far as muktzah is concerned, there is no iser muktzah in Peros Kodem Gmar Malach, even though the Rabbanan said that you're not allowed to eat an achilas keva even before Gmar Malacha. And even though he made a declaration, a verbal declaration, he's going to eat from these Peros, which gives it the status of kviyut, so that the Rabbanan will require afroshas truma, afroshas maser, even before he's allowed to eat what would normally be considered achilas haroy, and now is considered through his kviyus an achilas keva. That halacha only applies before he was mafresh. If he went ahead and he was mafresh and he violated the Isa Shmos of Afroshas Maser on Shabbos, then that's enough for tikkun, and there's no problem with his eating this fruit on Shabbos. Why? Because Tevel Muchanu Eitzel Shabbos. You can designate Achila on Erev Shabbos even on Tevel. Because Tevel is something which, in this particular case, since it's Kodem Gvar Malach on a Deraisa level, you're allowed to eat. And that validates your hachana when you designate it for Achila on Erev Shabbos. The fact that the Rabbanan say you cannot eat it until you're mafresh, that's a separate din. The Rabbanan required you to be mafresh maser, because in this case, his dibur was kovel maser, and now every achil is considered midrabanan as an achilas keva, which is prohibited. But all that is the Rabbanan. He went ahead and he rebelled against the Chachamim. He was mafresh maser shalom kedin. Is b'di'eved. It's tikkun, and there's no problem. So that's the chiddush. And yesterday we had a whole discussion how we derive this from the Mishnah. Now, the final maskana seems to be that according to Rabbi Eliezer and our Mishnah, the reason why on other years, other than Shemitah, he is not allowed to eat from these peiros, and he's chayiv in maser on these peiros, is because Shabbos povas lemas, even as we said over and over again in peiros before Gmar Malach. Uramini, I'm going to ask you a kasha from Rabbi Eliezer himself. There seems to be a self-contradiction between two statements of Rabbi Eliezer. The Mishnah in the 8th parak of Trumas reports that Hoya Ochel bi Eshkol, he was eating from a cluster of grapes before Maser, and normally we assume that grapes in Eretz Yisrael are designated for yayin. You send them again to the gas, to the press, and we make wine. So it's kodem shenigmar malach. V'nichnas migino lechotzer. He grabbed onto this cluster of peiros of anovim, and he took them from out there in the wild, in the gardens, or in the deserts out there, and he brought it into his own chotzer. And we have a look that chotz is kovas lemas. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yigma. What happened was he was eating the eshkol outside in the gina, and he was walking. He recited Borei Priya Eitz as a tfilas haderech, and now he walks into his chotzer. Chotz is kovas lemas. No, says Rabbi Eliezer Yigma. He started eating it outside of the chotzer. We're going to allow him to continue eating it in the chotzer. Rabbi Yeshua Omer lo yigma. No. Once he hits the chotzer, the peiros are now considered kviyim l'maseh, and he's not allowed to eat it, because even achilas aroy is considered achilas keva after the kviyus of chotzer. An identical machlokes we find in the end of the Mishnah, the Sefer of the Mishnah, Chashcha b'leili Shabbos. He started eating from this eshkol of hanovim before Maser, before Shabbos, and now sunset and it's Shabbos. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yigmar. Let him continue eating from these payros that he started eating, and Shabbos is not going to be Kovel Lemaser because it's before Gemar Malach. Rabbi Yeshua Omer Lo Yigmar. Rabbi Yeshua says you're not allowed to continue eating it because Shabbos is Kovas, even payros, Kodem Shenigmar Malachtan Lemas. And he's not allowed to eat even an Achilas Aroy. We see clearly from this Mishnah in Trumos that Rabbi Eliezer holds that Shabbos is not Kovas Lemaser. And that contradicts the proof that Rav Nachman adduced from our Mishnah here in Masechet Beitza that according to Rabbi Eliezer, Shabbos is Kovas Lemaser, even on Perish Lo Nigmar Malachtan. Gemara answers, Hasam. There in the Mishnah in Trumos, where Rabbi Eliezer allows you to continue eating on Shabbos, that's Kiriktani Taima. That you have to understand in the light of a Brisa that was not included in the Mishnah in Trumos, but was formulated to shed a light on the Mishnah in Trumos. Rabbi Nosson Omer, Lokish Omer Rabbi Eliezer Yigmar B'chatza Yigmar. Don't misunderstand Rabbi Eliezer and interpret him on a superficial level that he's allowed to continue eating in the Chatzer. That for sure is also even in Achilas Aroy, because Chatzer is Kovas Lamaser. El Yotzei Chutz LaChatzer V'Yigmar. Even though he took it from the Gina into the Chatzer, that's not Kovel Maser unless he wants to eat it in the Chatzer. But if he takes it out of the Chatzer, then he goes back to its original state of Kodem Kviyas Lamaser, and there he's allowed to eat an Achilas Aroy. And in the Sefer, Lo Kshama Rabbi Eliezer Yigmar B'Shabbos Yigmar, we're not going to allow him to continue eating on Shabbos because Shabbos is Kovas. Don't tell me that Rabbi Eliezer said that since you began eating on Erev Shabbos, therefore you're allowed to continue eating on Shabbos. Elamamtin Lamotzoi Shabbos V'Yigmar. What Rabbi Eliezer meant to say is that Shabbos is only like a temporary convenience. I would say it like this in my understanding, that Chatzer or Shabbos is koveh the Maisa Achila, not the Chefts of the Pri. The Chefts of the Pri is still Lo Nigmar Malachta. It cannot be Teva. Only the Maisa Achila in the Chatzer or during Shabbos, that is going to be also not because you've changed the Chalos HaPri, but because the Maisa is considered a Maisa Kvius and an Achila Shel Keva. But after Shabbos, or when he leaves the Chatzer, then Rabbi Eliezer holds he's allowed to continue eating. And based on this, our dik in the Mishnah that according to Rabbi Eliezer, on the years other than Shemitah, it's going to be also on Shabbos to eat from the payros, even before Gmar Malacha. That dik is correct, and there's no contradiction from the Mishnah that records Rabbi Eliezer's position, the Mishnah in Masechet Trumos. Ki also Ravin, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Statement of Ravin in the name of Rabbi Yochanan when he came from Bavel to from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. And this statement of Rabbi Eliezer has, I think, 4 parts to it. Let's see, we'll count it together. Echad Shabbos, number 1. Echad Truma, number 2. Echad Chatzer, number 3. And Echad Mikach. That's when you sell the payros. All of these are what's called kovim. They establish an achilas aroy as an achilas keva. Kulam ein kovim el b'davar shenigmar malachta. Rabbi Yochanan is paskening that in all these cases, the kovea only is activated after Gmar Malacha. And now the Gemara is going to go through each one of these 4 cases and prove that Rabbi Yochanan is coming lafuke, he's coming to exclude another opinion, a dissenting view. Shabbos, when he says that Shabbos is not kovea until after Gmar Malacha, lafuke mida Hillel. I mean, all the Rishonim want to know, why does the Gemara have to quote Hillel? We just finished proving that Rabbi Eliezer here in our Mishnah is of the opinion that Shabbos is kovas even before Gmar Malacha. And there are a host of different answers in the Rishon. But in any event, Hillel is outspoken about the fact that Shabbos is kovas lemaser even before Gmar Malacha. The Sanya, we learned to the Beitza, Amer peros mimakom lemakom. A person gathers together fruits and transfers them from one location to the other. Liktos. Liktos means to dry them in the sun and make them into what's called ktzios. Like, for example, he's going to flatten the figs and then he makes an eagle out of it around. He has a press that's round and he makes the igule dvela. And what happens is he's moving his payros from place to place. V'kiddush aleim hayom. And now the sun set on Friday evening. Om Rabbi Yehuda, Hillel liatzmo, Hillel on only Hillel. Liatzmo means he's the dissenting view, the Das Yochid. Oser, he says these payros are prohibited without maser, even though it's before Gmar Malacha, because, and we know it's before Gmar Malacha because his intention is to dry them. And he holds, Hillel, that Shabbos is kovas lemaser, even before Gmar Malacha. The Chachamim disagree because it's only Hillel liatzmo. They hold that ain't Shabbos kovas acher Gmar Malacha, and Rabbi Yochanan is teaching us that we paskin like the Chachamim.